Hi everyone, it's Alex, and today I wanted to talk about J.D. Salinger and themes of solitude and why he's one of my favorite writers. Of Salinger's work, everyone is probably most familiar with Catcher in the Rye, and this was also my first introduction into his work as well. I first read Salinger whenever I was 14 and I was in my English class, although this wasn't the required text. My teacher actually had us for the very last 10 minutes of class always be reading something, and then I never brought a book with me, so I picked this one off her shelf that she'd let us borrow, mainly because it looked to be the shortest. This book tells the story of a boy named Holden Caulfield, who I believe is actually maybe 16 or 17 in this book, and his journey throughout school as well as not in school, and how pretty much he believes everyone is being a phony and not being their true, authentic selves. Naturally, these ideas tie into a lot of things like existentialism and identity, and specifically innocence. And I feel like the way solitude plays into this is because I feel like with this book in particular, it seems to be, some people describe it as that their beef with it might be that Holden as a character actually doesn't change very much in this book. He's very drawn to his own values and beliefs and doesn't really budge with that, except whenever it comes to certain interactions he has with other people. So thinking of things like solitude, I in a way think sometimes, equating that word solitude with lonely or maybe being alone, that sometimes whenever we try to relate to people, much like what Holden does in this book, he doesn't feel very inspired. And really just the idea of what does it mean, especially at Holden's age, whenever we realize that life is made up of so much of what I think Holden is realizing is what are probably social constructs. But what I love so much about this book, among other things, are the very last lines in this, and it says, "Don't tell anybody anything, because if you do, you start missing everybody." And I truly feel like one of the loneliest feelings could be, again, that idea of when you share yourself with someone or when you get to know people, you're always at the risk of changing, and maybe in a way you might feel like you're missing a part of yourself that you used to be. And I think that's what Holden's really grappling with in this book as he's getting to know certain people. So because I read Catcher in the Rye, it made me really interested in more of his works. So the next thing I read by him was Franny and Zooey. This is the story of Franny and Zooey Glass of the Glass family. And the Glass family in the books I'm talking about today, and a lot of Salinger's work, it's a recurring pattern that he introduces people in that family, which is another great highlight, I think, from Salinger as sort of with his craft with his writing. In a way, I feel like Salinger as a writer almost felt coincidental to his whole ideas of life and how that's reflected in his books. So if I'm comparing solitude as a way in Holden feeling alone with confronting social constructs, I feel like this book is definitely sort of confronting how to feel solitude with religious ideas and beliefs. Franny and Zooey begins by Zoe's sister, Franny, being at home, I believe, with both of their mom, and their mother finds Franny praying consistently without stopping, and really Franny's just having this big existential crisis, and their mom calls Zoe to try to come over and make Franny feel better. So immediately, just like Catcher in the Rye, there are those patterns of existentialism and really wondering what does it mean to lead a life and what does our identity really mean. And I feel like, again, thinking of how people interact in Salinger's work, we have Holden that interacted with various characters in Catcher in the Rye. And then here, I love the dynamic between Franny and Zooey as siblings, as well as other people in the Glass family that we get to know. And calling back to those religious themes, I think I love how Salinger talks about religion, because to me, personally, I've always seen religion as a really great thing. I love people that feel so passionate about having an intimate relationship, whether that be with God or Buddha or whoever else. I just really admire the dedication and commitment to that, and how people are willing to want to learn more, maybe even love more, or feel willing to be a better person if that's what they feel like is helping them themselves. And it's just that free will that Salinger gives his characters that I love so much. And like I said, I really love it between Franny and Zooey as siblings here. And besides Franny and Zooey, there's also another member of the Glass family, and his name is Seymour. And we get to know more about him in Raise High the Roofbeam Carpenters and Seymour an Introduction. So these are actually two separate stories just in one book. The first story, Raise High the Roofbeam Carpenters, is a story about Buddy Glass, another member of the Glass family. And Buddy is actually on the way to Seymour's wedding. It's his wedding day, and on his way there, Buddy is left with these other attendants or attendees of Seymour's wedding on their way there. And it's really the first part of this with the first story, how Buddy is defending Seymour in his personhood. And I just love that as well, because much like when I read Franny and Zooey, I felt like there was this sincere attachment to trying to verify to each other, Franny and Zooey, who they saw as each other and how they see themselves. And I love getting to know people through stories, if that makes sense, like especially sibling dynamics. And it does pretty much the same thing here between Buddy and Seymour. And it's actually funny because I feel like in Franny and Zooey that, I believe if I remember correctly, Zooey at a time, he fakes a phone call to Franny pretending to be either Buddy or Seymour. Although unfortunately in the second part of this book with the second story, Seymour an Introduction, it's all from Buddy's perspective on Seymour's recent suicide. So it's like I said with Solitude, really, if it's also very lonely to think of how do we, for one, having grief, but also the responsibility to secure someone's personhood, especially a person you love very much, and how you want to represent the best part of themselves, whether that's having a relationship with religion or a relationship with people like Holden, or a relationship ultimately with ourselves. And how often do we get to talk to ourselves about how we care about others so deeply, much like Buddy does in his stream of consciousness style in the second part of this book, trying to rationalize how much he loves Seymour, even though Seymour won't hear it since he's passed. And finally, that brings me to 9 stories. 9 stories, as you might imagine, are actually, this is Salinger's short story collection, so there are 9 separate stories here. Although, I think it's the first story in here, I didn't even check. But there's one I remember so clearly, and it's called A Perfect Day for Banana Fish. And in that story, our narrator is actually Seymour Glass himself. And Seymour is, I believe, on some type of vacation with his wife at the beach or something. But he's clearly not doing very well. Seymour is actually a war veteran, so I believe he suffers from some type of PTSD. But it's reading this, I read Perfect Day for Banana Fish after I read Catcher in the Rye, after reading Franny and Zooey, and rereading it after Raise High the Roofbeam Carpenters, since I read that last, technically. But when it comes to finally getting Seymour's perspective, since I've been through all the Glass family by now, I've felt this, and that's what I made this video for. That's when I felt this overwhelming solitude and how Salinger writes about solitude in his characters through their lives. And really, it just reminds me to want to be good to others as best as I can. And that's why I read, because I want to be a better person, and I want to think deeply about how people feel, or how they could feel, and how all of our lives are connected in some way or the other. If you haven't read J.D. Salinger yet, I highly encourage you to. He's one of my favorite writers. Whether even not starting with Catcher in the Rye, maybe start with 9 stories. I always recommend that first to people just to get a feel of Salinger's writing, but regardless, I love all of his works. I really want to binge reread all of them soon. I haven't done that in a while. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.